Our speaker is Dr. Matthew Gray. He is a professor of forestry, wildlife, and fisheries. Dr. Gray is a founding member of the One Health Initiative, and he's also the associate director of the UTIA Center for Wildlife Health. He specializes in disease ecology, and his interests include transmission dynamics of emerging infectious disease and identifying management strategies that can thwart or eradicate outbreaks. Dr. Gray has degrees in wildlife ecology, mathematics, and statistics, and he uses these skills to unravel complex epidemiological interactions with his students, postdocs, and colleagues. Dr. Gray also studies wetland ecosystems, especially focusing on anthropogenic impacts on wetland communities and management activities to conserve biodiversity. Now, Dr. Gray, I want to add, is one of the few folks that I know who has overcome geographic, language, and other barriers and managed to build multiple global teams to tackle emerging pathogens. These teams are composed of folks who have historically refused to work with or share the results with anyone. And in many cases, they have been on opposite sides of an issue. But Dr. Gray has been able to bring these people to the same table and impress upon them the importance of working together. By creating these platforms where each team member explicitly states the details of their work, and then as a team, they brainstorm and divvy up tasks, research has been streamlined, data has been shared, and most importantly, research findings have been put into action. And this
I am not hearing Deb.
Uh-oh, yeah.
I think she's frozen. Oh.
A flattering introduction. Thank you, Deb. I'll take it from here. You're muted or something or froze up, Deb, so I'll just go ahead and continue. But thank you very much for that introduction. That's very nice. As Deb kind of hinted, the work I'm talking about today and a lot of the work that I've done in the past is multidisciplinary, and it really takes a team approach to address some of these complex issues related to One Health. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really focused around the project that the UT One Health Initiative is supporting through a seed grant. And because we just started really just a few months ago, we're not going to provide any data or anything like that. We'll talk a little bit about our progress. So it's really heavy on the justification for our work and really what we hope will be the long-term outcome of our efforts. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge the co-PIs for the seed grant, which are Neelam Pudial, who's a social scientist within FWF, and Nina Pfefferman, who's a mathematician from UTK, which you all know, and one of the co-directors of the One Health Initiative. We also have collaborators at multiple other universities, which you can see listed below, which include ecologists, economists, folks that specialize in trade, etc. So just want to acknowledge them as well. And we do have partnerships, which you'll see as I go through, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, industry, which is PJAC, and then the state wildlife agencies. So our question is really focused around this big issue of wildlife trade and global movement of pathogens. And wildlife trade is a fairly large business. It comprises around $300 billion annually, and encompassing 2.5 million animals per year, over 1,000 species in 180 nations. And it's the high income countries, especially the United States and the EU, that's driving over 75% of that demand. Although many of those animals are not coming from our particular countries, they're coming from other parts of the world, often underdeveloped parts of the world. This figure here on the left really kind of shows, on the bottom, you can see the increase in the number of shipments per year going up. It's continuing to go up as far as wildlife imports. And really just as far as imports into the United States, which again, this talk is going to focus on, really originating from all different continents, but especially originating from Asia, the Americas outside of North America, and Africa, and then going to various regions within the United States. So really all pulling from across the globe and really dispersing across the United States. And one thing we don't know very much about is we know what comes into our country, but we don't know how it disperses within the country. Okay, so we know very little about the domestic trade network. The other thing that you may not know if you haven't dealt with wildlife or wildlife trade is that there are no US policies or regulations to control, regulate, or support the clean trade of wildlife. You know, with agricultural animals, there's the World Health Organization, OIE, and they list diseases as being, or pathogens as being notifiable. And USDA APHIS controls requires animal health certificates for any agricultural animals that are traded, but that does not exist. The APHIS, which we'll talk about a little bit later, USDA APHIS does not regulate wildlife, and consequently there's this regulatory loophole. So basically, you can trade wildlife across international borders and not have to declare things as being free of notifiable pathogens. And, you know, that really just leaves the floodgates wide open. You know, we have basically open borders where pathogens can move freely across the globe. And, you know, we're really talking about millions of animals per year being traded. And there are industries associated with, obviously, wildlife trade, which we just mentioned here. And so that can affect those economies by moving maybe novel pathogens that can negatively impact their stocks, their captive stocks. But there's also this opportunity, this chance that there can be spillover to wild populations. And there's multiple examples of that occurring, which I'll reference a few a little bit later on. The particular model system that we're focusing on is trying to take a sliver of the wildlife trade industry, about just 1% of trade, which is the amphibian trade industry, but it has all the complexities, just not as the magnitude of typical wildlife trade, which makes it a nice model system. And within the United States, well, globally, trade is comprised mostly of frogs, and that's what you see with these big bands here on the top, and then the caudates or the salamanders are down on the bottom. So there is a small salamander trade as well. And again, if you can see with, since I moved the window over here, you can see that this is the origin countries here, and these are the destination countries, where the United States comprises over 50% of the global amphibian imports into our country. So it's about a $3 billion a year industry. And what we are particularly interested in are three globally emerging pathogens. There's 2 species of chytrid, BD and Bsal, and ranavirus, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a second. And they've collectively been responsible for the decline of over 500 species of amphibians. And so let's talk a little bit about, just give a little bit of background about those 3 pathogens. So BD, or Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, is if you study emerging infectious disease, especially with wildlife, you've heard of it. It's responsible for the greatest biodiversity loss in modern history associated with pathogens. Okay, so within the last 40 years, 30, 40 years, we've documented species extinctions, over 100 species extinctions associated with this one pathogen. It has a global distribution of trade is facilitating that, which we'll talk a little bit later about. And what it does is it causes epidermal hyperplasia, or thickening of the skin. And if you're an amphibian, that's not a good thing, because amphibians use their skin as semi-permeable, and they osmoregulate through their skin. Okay, so they change the composition of, take up electrolytes, etc., from water. They take water in, and etc. through their skin, also let water out. They also respire through their skin. So what happens when you have thickening of that skin, that permeability is compromised, and that creates this dysfunction. And it's actually that reduction in osmolar regulation that causes electrolyte imbalances, and ultimately that affects muscle function, leading to paralysis and cardiac arrest. And so this animal here, before I show that, this animal here, speaking of paralysis, is an animal, the top left. Let's see if I can find my cursor. Okay, well, I don't seem to see my cursor, but the image, the right image of the really nice stoic glass frog, that animal's dead. It's actually sat there, it's got chytridiomycosis, and it's had cardiac arrest, it's sitting on a leaf, and it is paralyzed. And that's what that pathogen does. The new species, so again, BD is relatively recently discovered, 1997. More recently, just within the last decade, a new Batrachochytrium was discovered, Batrachochytrium salamander-vorans. And it's originally thought to be from Asia, where it's been documented living with infected hosts and just basically as subclinical infections and no apparent disease in the wild, but now is emerging in Europe and moving across the continent from north to south. And it's really been associated with declines, especially in salamander that you can see here, which is the fire salamander. And it's caused multiple population extirpations across its range. And what Bsal does, unlike BD, it does affect the skin too, but it actually creates these necrotic ulcerations through the skin. So it burrows, literally kills the cells, and the pathogenesis hasn't been worked out quite yet of this pathogen. That's part of Deb's work. But it's probably, again, a function of a reduced ability to do osmolar regulation, potentially affecting cutaneous respiration, which many of our salamanders in the United States don't have lungs. So if your skin, and they totally respire through their skin. So if your skin isn't functioning, that's not good. And then finally, these little necrotic ulcerations create opportunities for bacteremia, so for bacteria to enter, get in the blood system, and cause complications. This is a striped newt, which is a threatened species of greatest conservation need here in the United States. And this animal here is in its later stages of Bsal chytridiomycosis. Again, paralysis, lethargy, an inability to have a righting reflex to flip yourself over are diagnostic signs of the later stages of disease. This animal was humanely euthanized immediately after this. The other major pathogen that has been associated with declines are ranaviruses. FV3 or frog virus 3 is the type species. There's actually 6 different species of ranaviruses that have been recognized. They do have a global distribution. They were discovered back in the 60s, and they've been associated with declines in wild populations and captivity. Now, the interesting thing about ranaviruses is they infect amphibians, reptiles, and fish, and they've been associated with die-off events in over 100 species of amphibians, 30 species of reptiles, and over 50 species of fish. So lots of reservoirs associated with that pathogen. And unlike the chytrids, which are a skin pathogen, ranaviruses are a hemorrhagic disease. They call it hemorrhagic disease, very similar to Ebola. In fact, it's been called the Ebola of ectothermic vertebrates. And it attacks and destroys the liver, the spleen, and the kidney and brain. And you can see it causes significant hemorrhaging, which you can also often just see grossly underneath the skin. And we've had die-offs right up in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, near Cades Cove, a pond called Gorley Pond. There's been die-offs of turtles, like you see here, in Blount County. And turtles really it affects their respiratory system. This one here is a box turtle that's in respiratory distress and dying from ranavirus. And you'll often find this one here that I found was actually still alive, covered in this mud puddle, covered with soot and everything, and could barely move, and was still moving a little bit and respiring. But really a horrific pathogen. All of these pathogens have tremendous transmission capability. One second contact from host to host is sufficient to result in transmission. And they have a fairly decent environmental persistence, which can add to those transmission pathways. And the R naughts have been estimated between 5 and 10 for these pathogens, which really emphasizes the ability for a very rapid invasion. And we often see these die-offs happening and ending with, you know, hundreds to thousands of animals dying within a couple of weeks. You know, the concern of these pathogens in the wild has been well documented, and their impacts on natural populations. But again, we're also talking about industry, and the amphibian pet industry, as well as the amphibian food industry, is a big industry, and there can be pretty significant losses. So this was one that we were associated with diagnosing for this company, and in basically a couple of weeks, they lost over $100,000 in profit. Because ranavirus, this is associated with ranavirus. Ranavirus got transmitted through their tanks, and boom, they lost tons of animals. So 2,000 tadpoles of horned frogs and 3,000, so 5,000 animals dead within a week. So industry doesn't like these pathogens either. And so we want to keep them out of industry, we want to keep them out of the wild, and especially minimize how trade may impact those movements. And it is happening. There has been some previous research, especially on a global level, some work that's been done that's coming into the United States and also in other ports. And so, you know, American bullfrogs are a big part of the trade. Actually, it's a big part of the amphibian food trade. If you didn't know, there are American bullfrogs all over the world. That we have shipped for basically bullfrog farming, and actually we receive generally half of those frogs back, ironically. There aren't very many bullfrogs farms here in the United States anymore because it's not that profitable, but in developing countries, it still is a very profitable way to make a living. It's also an excellent food source for local communities, and of course we eat bullfrog legs here. So lots of frogs being moved around the world. This is some work that was done in one of the largest eastern ports for amphibian trade, which is the Hong Kong port. And they documented a prevalence ranging for BD around 12% to, you know, the average prevalence for ranavirus being around 60%. So these animals are being moved around. There are different strains that exist and species of ranavirus that exist globally. There's also different strains of chytrid that exist, and Bsal hasn't yet been detected here in the US. So, you know, there's a big concern that trade is moving these around, and there's some evidence that that is certainly happening. In fact, that is the main hypothesis that exists for how Bsal got to Europe, is through the amphibian pet trade. Particularly with Asia. And Asian salamanders often are very brightly colored, and they dominate the international salamander trade. And so some of the collections here, that with some work that was done over in Europe, has shown that, you know, at least 64% of the breeders that were sampled had positive Bsal within their system. Some had ongoing outbreaks of Bsal and were losing animals. This is what we don't want happen, you know, coming to the United States. We don't want that pathogen getting here, or if it does, we develop ways that we can squash it out and minimize its impacts to industry, as well as the potential for spillover. And, you know, that potential, the potential for that pathogen getting here is pretty high. It is, to me, very likely it has crossed our borders within the last, you know, decade or so. There have been some regulations, which we'll talk about, kind of put into place to try to prevent that. But just as an example, this publication that reported, you know, basically the prevalence of Bsal in Asian salamanders that are commonly traded with the United States. Bsal prevalence is about 3% in the wild where they're collecting these animals. And based on us importing around 2 million over 10 years, they suggested that the United States could have already had 60 to 70,000 Bsal positive Asian salamanders come through our borders in the last 10 years. And so that's really exacerbated by the fact that we now know that Bsal can actually infect frogs. And it's been documented. This is a very, very common frog. Some of y'all may have seen these in pet stores, the fire-bellied toad. They can become infected with Bsal. These comprise a huge percentage of our frog imports into the United States. We've imported 3.5 million in the last 8 years. And in Germany, the prevalence rate for Bsal with this animal, this species, is around 8%. And if you multiply that out, we could have potentially been importing, 35,000 Bsal positive fire-bellied toads per year last 8 years. So, the risk of entry or the probability of entry, I should say, is pretty high. And what we really need to do is kind of understand the movements and how to potentially reduce infection. The other pathway of introduction, into the of any pathogen into the United States or elsewhere is through illegal trade, right? And so there have been cases that have documented infection prevalence, just a few though. There hasn't really been a really exhaustive investigation of illegal trade and how that facilitates pathogen movement in wildlife. But here are a couple with BD that 67% were infected in this particular case for these animals that were confiscated, and 60% infected with BD. And I'll just mention, as far as the prevalence estimates that have been reported in typical legal trade, have generally for chytrid have been around 10% to 20%. So, illegal trade may facilitate, the increase in prevalence of pathogens. Perhaps they're more crowded, they're more stressed underneath those conditions. So it's really important for us to take into consideration illegal trade as well. Albeit it may be a smaller pathway, it may have higher prevalence or an increased risk. So for y'all that work with domestic animals, livestock, etc., that OIE, that you need to have animal health certificates that are required. And I alluded to you before that right now we're in a regulatory loophole within the United States when it comes to wild animals. So USDA requires that all imported animals for agriculture or aquaculture need to be free of OIE listed pathogens. And actually, ranavirus and both chytrids are listed as OIE notifiable. But USDA will not require animal health certificates because they do not regulate wildlife. At the same time, Fish and Wildlife Service has no authority to regulate pathogens. So we're in this loophole of these two major federal agencies not being able to solve this problem because nobody has been directed of what they can do. Now, when Bsal was discovered and the threat to amphibians here in the United States, Fish and Wildlife Service said we have to do something. And so what they did do and what they can do is they can regulate wildlife trade underneath of the Lacey Act, which is basically the regulation to prevent the international movement of threatened and endangered species or invasive species that could threaten native biodiversity. And so the interesting thing is they listed this interim rule, which listed that actually the species themselves that could be potential hosts for Bsal were injurious to our native species because they could become infected with Bsal. And it's really kind of unprecedented to do that. And is to really list a species as injurious because of the microorganism on it. And so they listed if there was any evidence that a genus could be potentially infected with Bsal, they listed all the species under it as injurious. So that still has not really been challenged in court yet. It exists out there. And so what that did is it essentially stopped international trade of salamanders. Now, as you can imagine, well, PJAC, which represents the pet industry for all pets, and the amphibian trade industry, they were upset about this, but salamanders only comprise 6% of the market. So they were willing to go along and basically say, okay, yeah, we support this ban. In fact, we'll do a voluntary ban on it anyways, you know. And so, but frogs are another story because they comprise the majority, now 99% of our international trade. Okay, so you know, how do pathogens move? Again, this could be any wildlife species, but you know, they're moving globally. They're coming through our borders. For wildlife, they're being checked to make sure that they are not, you know, globally listed species that are listed underneath of CITES. And so that's basically equivalent of our like Endangered Species Act. These are species of concern, or they're not listed as being injurious in the context so that they could really be a concern as far as an invasive species. First of all, the load of trade into our borders is way beyond the search capability of the wildlife inspectors. Okay, so only a small percentage, maybe 1% of the shipments are really actually opened and looked at in the first place. And so and then if they are, it doesn't matter if they're infected with something because there's no monitoring at all. So as you can imagine, you know, wherever these animals come from, they're shipped in, they go to distributors, and eventually, you know, they get to consumers. And those consumers may have actually different values. You know, maybe a specialist that really is trying to get certain types of amphibians, maybe very knowledgeable about pathogens, or wouldn't, you know, necessarily release an animal. They would know that would be not a good thing, but maybe the less knowledgeable consumers just would. They maybe think it's a good thing to take their salamander they no longer want, or their frog they no longer want, and take it to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and let it go and be free with its, you know, with its fellow amphibians out there in this beautiful habitat. Unbeknownst to them, that animal's infected with a deadly pathogen from around the world, the other side of the world. And then, of course, we have our native amphibians here, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but for those of you all that don't know, when it comes to salamander biodiversity, the United States leads the entire world in salamander biodiversity. 50% of the biodiversity of salamanders exists in North America, and right here in Southern Appalachia, we are the global hotspot. So it's a big concern with respect to something that could impact, like Bsal, that biodiversity. So it does happen. I just went on caudate.org and Googled salamander release or detections, and this is a Chinese fire belly newt. And so this is a posting from a couple people interacting and discussing. This was found outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. And this particular newt can be infected with Bsal. It's one of the most traded species that exists out there in the pet trade, and it's going around a wetland here, okay? And, you know, this person's, you know, asking, you know, do you think this could be a concern? I left it out there and somebody's coming back and he says, well, I'm not an expert. Although when I read the blog, the person knew a lot about the life history of salamanders. But I see no reason why this species couldn't thrive here, except for possibly being outcompeted by a larger native newt species. And then, you know, the guy comes back and says, you know, I'm not condoning, you know, releasing these animals in the wild. What I'm saying, it's unlikely that they could be a threat to other species. So it may be true that if you release one animal and it's a male and it's of one species or a female, most of our amphibian species can't just reproduce by themselves. Some can actually, but this one can't. And so maybe they're thinking about it's not really that big of an effect, but they're not thinking about the microorganisms on them that could have a substantial effect on survival of populations. So that's where our work is really focused on a lot in the last 5 years, is trying to understand the threat, in particular of Bsal, to potential biodiversity losses here in the United States if if or when it emerges. And so we've been, fortunately supported by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the NSF, and lots of other collaborators, state agencies, and even private organizations providing funds. And what I'll just do is I'm just going to give you a quick overview of this threat, just as a case example of why we need to be concerned about pathogen movements and trade. And what we've done, again, over the last several years is we've tested the susceptibility of 36 species of amphibians to this particular pathogen, Bsal, in biosecure facilities here at UT and a couple of the other collaborating universities. And what we've learned as far as our native species is that 72% of them can become infected. And that includes these most speciose families. So we've got the newt families, and we also have the lungless This is the lungless salamander family, which is the most speciose, and what are our biodiversity lies up in the Smokies. This is actually a Blue Ridge 2-line salamander that's very susceptible to Bsal. But we've also found that invasive species such as the Cuban tree frog can become infected. And another highly traded species, the Mexican axolotl, which is actually endangered in Mexico, but is a big part of the medical and pet trade, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And of those, over a third of the species actually develop the disease. So you do have some species that become infected and live with it with subclinical infections and even may clear the infection. And then you do have about a third that actually develop the disease. And what we did when we did this research was attempt to provide attempt to test across the phylogeny that exists within the United States, an attempt to get a representative estimate or sample of what invasion might look like within a community here. And I think we did a pretty good job in doing that. And assuming that 36% of our species could potentially develop the disease. You've already seen that video. Over 60 species in the US and over 140 species in North America could experience declines and be in threat of extinction if Bsal gets here. So we've done some pretty exhaustive work to demonstrate that we have here in North America, our communities are composed of lots of species that could be suitable hosts, and about a third or a little more of those species could develop the disease and experience declines or extinctions. And so what we did after we did those initial analyses is that we did some geographic analyses of invasion risk. So we coupled our species suitability, where those species are located, the distribution of those species, and environmental suitability of Bsal within the United States to map risk of invasion within communities. So this is the likelihood of infection. And you can see that the Northwest here, but pretty much the entire United States has excellent climate and suitable hosts. There aren't too many places where they would escape the likelihood of Bsal getting into those communities. But that's just risk of infection. So we combine that with risk of mortality, of disease developing, and the map changes a little more. Again, the eastern United States being highlighted and the western United States being highlighted for high at-risk communities composed of species that have a high likelihood of mortality. And then we combine those to really look at extinction risk. And that's what you finally see here on the far right here with Tennessee and Kentucky and several of the southeastern states. Really, southern Appalachia here having a high risk of extinction, as well as, again, the western United States here. We took that, and this is just looking at risk of extinction, and we combine that with actually species richness. Where do we expect the greatest biodiversity losses? And as I mentioned before, 50% of the world's salamanders are in North America. Tennessee is number 2 in the United States. Georgia's number 1. North Carolina's number 3. So I mean, all the biodiversity is centered, as you can see right here in southern Appalachia. And we do expect the greatest biodiversity losses to occur within the Appalachian region and right here within like the tri-corners here. And of course, the western United States, we expect pretty high biodiversity losses too, okay? Where are the where are there resistant species, or where are communities most composed of resistant species? Not many places, okay? The upper Midwest is expected to have less declines because they're dominated, at least salamander communities dominated by a group of salamanders that are pretty resistant. They're called the mole salamanders, the Endostomatidae. They may get infected, but they usually don't develop the disease. Okay, so, why should we care? Again, this is just building on this justification of amphibians for those of y'all that don't study wildlife or don't study amphibians, is that amphibians are in peril. In fact, they're the most imperiled class of vertebrates that exist on Earth. So over a third of them are in threat of extinction, which you see here as listed by the IUCN. And it's estimated that 40 to 50% of the species are in decline in comparison to 12% of birds and 23% of mammals. And we should care because they're important components of our ecosystems. There's a variety of ecosystem services that they provide. And this is really that One Health connection. And so they are important in carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling. The biomass of salamanders in Appalachia can exceed, per unit area, all the other vertebrates combined. So you can add up all the biomass of the salamanders and then take your bears and your raccoons and your birds, your snakes that are in an acre, and it can exceed that biomass. So as you can imagine, they're extremely important with respect to sequestering carbon, organic carbon in their biomass, but also nutrient cycling through their consumption of invertebrates. So all amphibians are insectivores, and they take that matter and obviously consume invertebrates and then defecate that and break those down into different nutrients and stuff. And so, the food web is extremely reliant on amphibians. So you have various mammals and reptiles that are eating amphibians, and they in turn are eating thousands upon thousands upon millions of insects. And that really links into this other aspect when it comes to public health. And so just like bats, amphibians are excellent insectivores. They eat insects as larvae, so in the aquatic stage, which can be very important for consuming like mosquito larvae, and they're very effective at controlling mosquito larvae, as well as adults. Like this 1 inch, this is a cricket frog, 1 inch cricket frog, 1,000 of them can eat 5 million insects per year. So you can have substantial control of insects, some of these which have agricultural pest consequences or connections, as well as links to zoonotic pathogens. So they can play a big role in public health. And they also have tremendous biological potential. Amphibians are the first land vertebrates. They have existed for over 300 million years on this planet. They've survived 3 mass extinction events, including the one that ended the dinosaurs. And they have a tremendous amount of potential biological mysteries locked up within their evolution. And so a couple of known aspects of their physiology is they produce antimicrobial peptides. One discovery made by Louise Rollins Smith, who's down at Vanderbilt University that we collaborate with, she's demonstrated that some of those antimicrobial peptides can inhibit HIV. Some work that was done by John Daly and the late John Daly at NIH was looking at sequestering some of the skin toxins out of amphibians and using those for analgesics. And so it's been demonstrated that these toxins can target the nicotinic and the opioid receptors for pain relief, and be 20 to 40 times more potent than morphine and not be addictive. And lastly, there's a lot of work being done with axolotls, the Mexican axolotl, with respect to limb regeneration. And so unlike our cells that become programmed into skin, muscle, connective tissue cells that can never go back to the original stem cells, amphibian cells are different. amphibian cells can change back into undifferentiated cells like stem cells and help regenerate limbs. And so right now there are various medical professionals, scientists that are attempting to understand how that programming occurs. And can we replicate that to be able to grow organs or to grow limbs or et cetera in humans? So there's a lot of biomedical potential, and among a variety of other areas of research that folks are doing. They also, as I mentioned, play a big role in the food and pet trade. And lastly, you may have heard that amphibians are good ecological indicators. And the reason is, and that's true, the reason is because they use both the aquatic and the terrestrial environment. So they're exposed to stressors in both environments, plus they have that semi-permeable skin where they can absorb, various toxins and et cetera in the chemicals in the environment. So if you see amphibians dying, they could be good ecological indicators for other wildlife species and humans for that matter. But with that, that's our model system. Amphibian trade is just our attempt to really get at a bigger question, which is, global wildlife trade. And so this article that was published in National Geographic, I encourage you to go and take a look at it, by Jonathan Colby. Right amidst the COVID pandemic, he published this and raised the concern about, every year 200 million live wild animals are imported into the US every year. And the global movement of animals without any requirements for clean trade is asking for negative impacts on wild populations, on domestic populations, and on human health. And we just lived a pandemic that from a pathogen that evolved in bats, right? And so these species jumps have occurred multiple times in history. They will occur again. And the unregulated trade the lack of requirement for clean trade and the support of government for clean trade is really is needed, and has been for a long time. And so we need to begin to understand pathogen movements in wildlife and start thinking about clean trade. And I stole this from the One Health Initiative presentation website. And just to recap for those that may not be aware, is that as far as emerging infectious diseases, 75% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonoses. Okay, they move between animals and humans, and of that, about 70% of them come from wildlife. So around 50% of the emerging infectious diseases associated with zoonoses are wildlife derived. Okay, and so it is, it's critical that we think about pathogen movement and trade. Now, this used to be a big number to think about when we think about how zoonoses impact the U.S. economy, causing around $7 billion per year in losses. But now with COVID and the COVID emergence, it's kind of almost laughable. That's a big number, 7 billion. But when you think that the estimates out of Harvard are someplace close to 16 trillion by the time this pandemic ends, that's 90% of the annual US GDP. So movement of zoonotic pathogens in trade, their emergences and the consequences on economics are substantial. And the key is early monitoring, detection, and control, okay, and eradication. You don't want to wait until it gets into your general population of humans or wildlife for that matter, because controlling it, as we all saw, is very difficult. It's very political. It's a challenge, okay? So we want to be able to monitor and respond. All right, so let's quickly turn here towards the last part of the presentation. I see we're at 12:50, to what our system sort of looks like, and and how it may move. And it's really this trade system, the amphibian trade system, is like most wildlife trade systems, where you have imports that can be coming from legal and illegal pathways. They're moving to distributors. They could be going to breeders. One unique thing about the amphibian trade industry is that they also have hobbyists. So you may have some folks that just have maybe 5, 10 tanks, and there's a whole hobbyist group as opposed to a commercial breeder. And then of course you've got retailers like PetSmart and other places like that. And of course the consumers are interacting here, right? So they're purchasing from this trade network, okay? And when we think about, when we think about the threats to wildlife, it's really this network itself, as well as the consumers, both have this opportunity to have spillover to the natural ecosystem, either through deposition of contaminated aquarium contents into the environment, or release of unwanted animals. And so we've got this opportunity for spillover. And the really cool thing scientifically, kind of the edge of, I think, our proposed research is really looking at how humans affect and modify the movement of pathogens, the amplification of pathogens across this network. So how do consumers make different decisions that drive industry dynamics, that could affect, pathogen movements and amplification? How can government policies change that? How can industry strategies change those dynamics? And right now, we don't have a good model to do that. And so that's what we've proposed to do over the next several years. For the One Health Initiative project is just a sliver of that, okay? Just to get some preliminary data. So, ultimately, the kind of the big questions is, what is pathogen prevalence in international shipments and domestic trade? What factors in industry and nodes contribute to amplification? How are factors driven by these socioeconomic feedbacks of industry and consumers? What's the willingness of industry or consumers to implement strategies to reduce disease risk? And what is the perceived non-market value of wildlife, in this case, amphibians, that the public has or consumers have? And so, as you can imagine, there's, what you saw from one of the first slides, we have a group of economists, social scientists, mathematicians, ecologists, that are working together to attempt to start to tackle this question for this system that can hopefully be applied to later, or to other trade networks. And so this is what we propose for our One Health Initiative grant, is to get initial estimates of pathogen prevalence in the amphibian pet industry, obtain estimates of total trade volume, economic value, and husbandry practices in each of these nodes of the industry and the connectivity of those nodes, and to evaluate consumer preferences, and also then to build a simplified model using our sampling that we do within industry. Use a model to basically say this is where we should be focusing our efforts in the future on sampling as we begin to roll out the larger project. The larger project has been proposed to NSF, DEB, Division of Environmental Biology, the EID program. And we just found out, unfortunately, this morning that we weren't ranked as highly competitive. It's the highest ranking you can get from this panel, but that it wasn't supported. And so they want a few more details on some of our methods, and they also said they ran out of money, unfortunately. So we're excited to revise the proposal and resubmit it, and hopefully bring these funds to the University of Tennessee. With that, I'm at 12:55. I do have like another probably 15 slides to go through, but we're at the end, so I'll just open it for questions. And so let me actually, flip to the end. This is just going through how we're going to do everything. So it's, just basically methods. We can discuss offline, share our proposal, and how sampling can work. Thank you for providing those, Nina. I'm sorry to get to talk about, but they're really good illustrations of how we can identify the network and where we are right now. So we have been in discussions with the pet industry. We have weekly meetings with them. They've been great and very eye-opening with respect to the implementation of this project. And we've got some really good partners they're willing to champion this for it. They're kind of leaders in the industry, which is cool. It's the NSF grant. I wanted to end, oh yeah, John Nash with game theory, the super interesting, cool part of the modeling aspect that we proposed that Nina was a big part of. But this is where we kind of want to be at the end, is, you know, to help develop this knowledge in a predictive capacity and partnerships necessary to establish clean trade, you know, and you know, have that ultimately be supported by, ideally by the federal government to facilitate the program, but not just amphibians, you know, wildlife wide. I mean, this is what really needs to be done. And so with that, I'll leave it on that slide for questions. And sorry for running a little bit late. I meant to leave more time, but I don't have anything after this for anybody that wants to stay on longer.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions? You can either type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. So I do want to point out that, and I'm sorry I got cut off earlier, that this is an excellent example, as I know Matt already pointed out, of taking a One Health approach. And I hope that that's obvious to everybody. So it's clearly something that uniting across disciplines and building a team that will do something that's going to have far-reaching effects.
Stop the share there. And see everybody. Any questions?
And also, if Nina or Neelam, I'm not sure if Neelam's still on, if either of you want to add anything, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. I thought you gave a great talk on the system and what we wanted to do. Thank you.
Okay. The real fascinating part of the proposal is the modeling stuff.
Yeah, this is Joshua Fu.
Yeah.
How are you?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Good. Matt, this is a great presentation. I learned a lot from this, and I got a question for you because I'm working on the climate change a lot, and there is one is involved to the a heat wave caused the waterborne disease. Will that to linkage to your result, or you consider that to be a part of your model? Maybe Nina, Nina, you are here, you are mathematicians.
Yeah. So we didn't propose that. That's something we could maybe incorporate, you know, but these are captive systems, so they're relatively climate controlled. We didn't model anything outside of the captive network. That was our goal. And so they're kept under pretty strict kind of climate conditions based on the needs of the species. But there's no doubt that climate change can impact the likelihood of emergence of pathogens across multiple systems, including amphibian diseases. And we expect, okay, we'll see, Anina, we expect that to have different effects on different species or even different pathogens. So there are some pathogens, such as rhinoviruses, you increase the temperature, you increase the replication rate, you increase the pathogenicity. But for example, for Bsal, it's actually a fairly cool loving pathogen. And if it increases up to, if you even have an amphibian and increase it above 22C, it tends to clear the pathogen. And that's just thinking about temperature. Moisture itself also can affect the likelihood of transmission, especially with the amphibians. So the more moist it is, the more humid it is, maybe the environmental persistence of the pathogen is greater. So climate change is really important, you know, and it's a really good point. We do have some work where you saw those, you saw the risk maps. So the next step with those risk maps that we're collaborating with Bill Sutton at Tennessee State University is to incorporate climate change in the risk.
Thank you.
Hey, I do wonder though, that's a good point. So sometimes these species are collected from the wild, correct? So might there be some impact that we might see pathogens we didn't expect to see, more likely to be in the trade route with?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, depending on how they're holding them in captivity, and that could be temperature, humidity dependent, but also just, how are they circulating the water, their biosecurity practices, the density of the animals. And that's really the nitty gritty of our proposal, is to try to understand those basic husbandry, animal care practices that would cause this like magnification of the pathogen within a facility, and to build models that would say, okay, these are the key points, that basically industry is making this decision, and this is how they could change, humans could change the dynamics by changing these few factors. Is ideally, that's the goal.
Hey Matt, I have a kind of a naive question. You mentioned the wild animal trading. Not much inspection was done to look at the pathogens. So what kind of inspection they are actually used for to prevent the pathogens being treated around?
Okay, so what kind of inspections are done with wildlife? The only inspections that are done are to make sure that we are not importing or exporting species that are not allowed to be imported or exported based on their species status and their listing here in the United States, or listing globally from an endangered species sort of standpoint. So there is no requirement for wildlife to test them for pathogens. The only thing that's close to that are fish that are in aquaculture. USDA considers them a part of agriculture, and so they will do the inspections. Now, the infrastructure is all there. USDA could just inspect, wildlife inspectors could inspect, for the species composition of a shipment, and then USDA could simply make sure the animal health certificates are there, or they could train Fish and Wildlife Service to do that. But it's like that simple of a solution of, okay, we require animal health certificates, and we're going to give the authority to Fish and Wildlife Service to do it for wildlife. So while you're doing your wildlife inspections, just make sure they have these animals. That is a solution, period. I mean, that would solve it. But it's amazing that something so simple like that cannot be accomplished. They just look at each other like, well, it's not my responsibility, not my responsibility. So we've got this open floodgate. I assume that we will see some sort of, in the future, and that's the goal, some comprehensive legislation to be put together to facilitate clean trade, like there is for agriculture, because that's what's needed. To do it, the thing is it's, to be fair, it's like, okay, Fish and Wildlife Service, now this is your responsibility. But it's not like you can just say it's your responsibility. You've got to have the inspectors. You got to have the resources. And if that tanks the entire industry, because all of a sudden you go from a $5 amphibian to a $30 amphibian because you have to have molecular testing done, well, that's, you're destroying the industry. So there needs to be government support in that capacity. So our goal is to actually estimate the cost, the worth of the amphibian pet industry or trade industry here in the United States, and the cost of what would take to implement these different strategies, what would be the most effective strategies, so that you can, approach this issue, with and the response to it, and maybe future programs with more information. Right now, there's zero information for the most.
It's amazing when you talk about this to think about all the potential risk of the pathogen around.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. Thank you for a very nice talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like we just have a few folks left. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, looks like that's it.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. We'll see you later.